Hello, my name is Levon Afeyan, and we come to you today from Yerevan, Armenia. My guests today are two brothers that many of you may have known or have heard of. Their names are Raffi and Patrick Elliott. So let me first welcome you both to our program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You were both born in Montreal to a Canadian father of Irish descent and an Armenian mother who had immigrated to Canada from Aleppo, Syria at a young age. Your father, a graduate of McGill Law School, comes from a deep-rooted Canadian family, and your mother, being the youngest of 7 siblings, settled in Canada and became a dentist. You, along with your younger sister, Maral, attended the Nareg Armenian School, where you learned the Armenian language and culture. Raffi, after finishing high school, you attended University of Ottawa and received your bachelor's degree in political science and economics. Patrick, you attended Concordia University, where you studied the field of history and religion. Raffi, you are now working with one of Armenia's largest tech companies. You're also a freelance journalist. Patrick, you have a branding agency serving clients internationally, and you're also the co-founder of a tax optimization and company relocation firm in Yerevan. Somehow, both of you ended up in Armenia. Raffi, you were first to make that leap. You moved here 10 years ago, got married, and already have 2 beautiful children. Patrick, you moved around Europe, spending time in Amsterdam, Spain, and Poland, but you finally decided that Yerevan was where you wanted to settle. You also got married and have a wonderful son who was actually born here. So let's go back to the early 90s. What was life like in your family? How did you embrace the idea of speaking Armenian and being able to consider yourselves Armenian? In other words, how did this upbringing influence your identity?
We grew up in a family where my father, as you mentioned, is Canadian of Irish heritage, and our mother is Armenian from Syria. Incidentally, though, we didn't actually grow up speaking that much Armenian at home because my mother grew up when Syria was a protectorate of France, and she went through a lot of the French Catholic school system. And so her Armenian was mostly just things that you yell at your children for them to behave rather than conversational. But we, both of us went to the Nareg school in Montreal from kindergarten until grade 6, where we learned to read and write in Armenian. And outside of that, in Armenian church, we and my mom's friends, there weren't really that many opportunities to speak Armenian. And for us, it always felt a little, at least for me in particular, it felt kind of useless because it's not a language that I needed to succeed in Canada. So really, it's not till 2003 when I visited Armenia for the first time, where all of the effort that went into learning a language and an alphabet that is ineligible to anybody else in my surroundings actually began to make sense, because when I arrived in Armenia, I could read the signs, I could communicate with the people. And to me, that's when it clicked that if all of the cultural input that we were fed growing up in the 90s in Canada only made sense in the context of it being of use for us in Armenia. And that was 2003, and 19 years later,
here we are.
I'm here, yeah.
And Patrick, how did your upbringing help identify you as an Armenian?
I mean, I always found it to be something kind of cool, like some kind of secret language that other people don't have. We always joke around at home that we speak French day to day. We speak English with my dad. We speak Armenian when we want other people not to understand, and when everyone's angry, everyone's shouting in Arabic. So it's just a funny dynamic that we grew up with. But it was always interesting to have. As we would go to church, we went to scouts and all that stuff. But it wasn't until going to high school where I left Armenian school that it really became this kind of precious thing. There was in 1 year there happened to be an Armenian in my class. Arman, if you're watching this, you know who you are. But there was one Armenian, and it was just super fun because we can talk about the teachers, we can talk about girls, it was just this thing that we did, that nobody else understood. We would share these looks during history class in high school, at French Canadian high school, when the teachers started talking about the Armenian genocide. It was this thing that only he and I shared, Again, I still remember having to explain where or what Armenia was to my French-Canadian girlfriend's parents, and talking about the genocide and all that stuff. So it's kind of like this, it was always this precious thing that I didn't fully really understand. Not that I was ignorant of it, it's just that I just felt like this cool advantage over other people, but not something that I thought would be of practical use, I suppose. And I never imagined I would be moving over here. So.
Brings me to my next question, actually, is that you both basically Armenians by choice. You accepted that. And not only have you moved to Armenia, you're also raising families here. What was the main reason that you each moved to Armenia, if you can discuss that briefly? And was it easy to take that decision?
Yeah, for me it was not, like I said, it was something that I never thought I would do, but moving around had kind of prepared me for that. I never thought I would end up living in Poland. I went there for business and I ended up meeting the person who's today my wife, and I ended up staying 5 years there. So we would visit since it was really close, and Raffi was already here, so it was always an opportunity to go. And my wife speaks Russian, so there was no cultural clash for her. And me spending time in Eastern Europe, I noticed a lot of similarities as well, so it helped me kind of acclimate faster. But it just got to the point where my visa was expiring. We were engaged. We want to have kids. We have one now, thank God. But we were thinking about a family, and it got to the point where I understood that I would have to make the choice. If I were to stay in Poland and with a Polish wife, and me being half Armenian, it would be very tempting for my son to grow up not understanding or not appreciating his roots. I come across many people nowadays like, oh, you live in Armenia. I have clients when I'm doing Zoom calls with the United States. Oh, my grandmother was Armenian. I don't ever want my son to speak like that. So, it's kind of this fun fact, How nice, how quaint that you live in Armenia. I don't like that. So it was just, it was a simple decision where I had to go somewhere. And instead of going back west, the decision was to go further east. Now, of course, the deal was we'll go, we'll see if we like it, and if we like it, we'll stay. If we don't, we'll leave. So far, it's been 1.5 years, and when I left the country twice since moving here, and both times, the first day, I was like, I want to go home. I want to come back here. So, yeah.
How about you, Raffi? How did you take the decision?
Well, people who know me might describe me as being a little impulsive, although I like to call it spontaneous. And I just kind of finished school and applied for a job at a company that had a representation both in Brussels and in Armenia, but because I was not an EU citizen and I was a resident of Armenia, had the permanent residency before moving there, they offered me a job in Armenia, and so that kind of worked out for me. That was 10 years and 6 months ago. But before that, to be honest, I always wanted to come back to Armenia ever since I'd visited the first time, and every trip I took sort of cemented my relationship with the country. So the decision was essentially mostly predicated by the job, but also obviously a sense of patriotism and also a sense of adventure. I like to, one thing I always found in Canada that wasn't quite fulfilling was the fact that everything that needed to be built was already built. Whereas in Armenia, there's always something to do.
Of course.
And for somebody with my personality, I think that makes Armenia always exciting for me. I never get bored here. It's been 10 years, and so many things have happened.
So moving forward, you were diasporan Armenians for the major part of your life. Now you are repatriates. How can you describe the relationship between the diaspora and Armenia? I mean, some of the subjects that came to mind, for example, are there enough interactions between the two different peoples? Is Armenia being portrayed correctly in diaspora? Do diasporan Armenians of your generation understand the reality of Armenia?
I think that, look, I'm a big believer in the fact that human beings sort of act in organic processes. And Armenians, on the other hand, because of the fact that for so many centuries we didn't have a state or a physical homeland with borders, and we were spread around the world as a diaspora, that we kind of created these ersatz state structures around, the church, the various political organizations, cultural organizations that we collectively all belong to, and so those made sense when there was no state, but we've had a state now for 31 years, and I think that those of us who were used to growing up in these specific types of structures have still not adapted to the existence of like a Republican UN-recognized nation-state of Armenia, and thus haven't really reoriented themselves towards it, which, as some people pointed out, they treat Armenia as if it were one of the other diaspora communities, the Argentinian Armenians, Canadian Armenians, the Armenia Armenians, whereas in reality it should be like, the gravitational pole of the entire global Armenian community. So fundamentally, I think that is the issue. Largely speaking, of course, it's also the fact that these same people who run many of these types of organizations probably have failed to understand that Armenians as a people are actually extremely diverse, both in terms of from which part of the world that they call home and therefore have absorbed cultural elements, but also within themselves. I mean, they have different political points of views that do not necessarily relate to Armenia itself. They have different sexual orientations, they have different perceptions of what it means to be Armenian and how their Armenian identity plays into the other aspects of their identity. And none of that really exists in the diasporan discourse, both towards the diaspora and towards Armenia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the relationship between Armenia and the diaspora is not fit for purpose, for lack of a better term. It's just not fit for purpose. Armenia itself has a branding problem, and that Armenia is not doing a good enough job. I would say even just on the world stage, just presenting itself as a tremendous place for investment, for business, for lifestyle, there's a lot of advantages to being in Armenia. And on the other hand, the diasporan communities, unfortunately, it's kind of this endless loop that we have to preserve Armenianness. Yeah, but why? Well, to preserve Armenianness. Well, why? Well, so that we can stay Armenian. Yeah, but there's one place where you can do that, and it's here. So on both ends, I think that there needs to be a reorientation of the relationship. And I think that the good news is, especially nowadays with the internet, with everything is much more decentralized. As I always say, the future is anarchist. So you have individuals who are able to see, to access, to get an idea of what Armenia is like and be drawn towards it. And as Raffi pointed out, we've been coming here on and off since 2003. This is the first time, since moving here, it's the first time I've noticed an influx of foreigners, and I don't mean the recent wave of Russians who don't have the choice. What I mean is an influx of foreigners who are coming to Armenia because they want to be here. And so if Armenians themselves don't decide that the future lies here, no problem. I'm not here to judge anybody, but drop the boycott. It's a waste of your time. Be honest that you have no intention of coming here, and that's fine. But if not, others will come. There's Americans here that I've met. There's French that I've met, Latvians, Indians, there's Filipinos. Like they're coming because they see the advantage. So if
Filipinos who've had kids here.
Yeah, I've met young Indians when we were lining up to get vaccinated. I met a young Indian, and the 8-year-old son was translating for his mother because they've been here 7 years, and he speaks fluent Armenian. The world is changing.
To this caricature I saw years ago. And it was a beautifully depicted caricature, and it sort of showed the borderline of Armenia with somewhere else. And this man dressed in, I would describe old attire, maybe Soviet-looking things, with luggage that looked very old, and was walking out of Armenia. And there was a Western-looking man with shorts and a backpack and a cap walking into Armenia. And they both were looking at each other at the border and both making the sign, "Are you crazy?" And then the incoming person didn't understand why the Hayastansi was leaving, and the Hayastansi didn't understand why this guy would actually move back to Armenia. It seems to me that you are witnesses of that situation, where you see the benefits of Armenia as opposed to, and ignore the fact that so many people have chosen to leave.
Look, just to be 100% upfront, I'm not in a position to judge the hardship that locals have endured for a 30-year period and continue to endure, right? I don't yet know the fear of my son's approaching 17th birthday, knowing that that'll be the last one we'll be together as a family, because the next one he's going to put his life at risk. So whenever I meet people who say, I want to go, I tell them, go where your heart lies. It's not a problem. And it's like the Amish Rumspringa, right? Where Amish kids, when they're about to turn 18, they have to go into the real world for 1 or 2 years, see the modern world, and then decide if they want to come back. Because when they come here because they want to be here, it's a very, very different dynamic. And so there's nothing wrong with going out, seeing the world. And we are starting to see an influx of repatriates who are not spirkahais, but who are locals who went, built businesses, lived life, and then they go, I want to come back here with my kids. I want to come here and build a life. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think that, again, it's really about changing the facts on the ground over here, branding the country accordingly, so that those who want to come will come. And I do believe in my heart that once the world understands what a good place this is, there's going to be more of an influx than people leaving.
Many Armenians, both in Armenia and the diaspora, believe that the so-called old approaches linking Armenia to the diaspora, and vice versa, of course, are no longer working. We mentioned that earlier. Almost everyone I speak to is convinced that a new formula is needed to bring together this tremendous potential of the diaspora with key players in Armenia. In your opinion, in what ways do the old approaches need to be modified, on both sides, of course, to make this desirable reality happen? In other words, what needs to change on both sides?
So look, I didn't do very well in math in high school, so I can't speak to the formulas themselves, but that said, I think that while a lot of people seem to recognize that the old structures are not functioning so well, I think we're also ignoring the fact that in reality, new structures have been forming themselves for the last 30 years. They're just under the radar, nobody's noticed, or at least the people involved in them have. Again, like human beings, congregate organically. Over the last 30 years, we forget the fact that many people from here have not only immigrated, but many have left and studied and traveled and come back. Many people from the diaspora have come here and experienced Armenia, maybe lived here 6 months to a year or so on. And so this process of these two Armenias reconnecting with each other has already been happening under our noses in reality, at least the way I see it. Last time my dad was here visiting us, we were in a cafe and my dad pointed out that he could no longer tell who in the cafe was diasporan versus local. And that kind of clicked in my mind because it's true. I mean, it's not that obvious anymore. Before it was, anybody who's been to Armenia in the 90s or the early 2000s, you can point them out on the street.
You always knew.
So now these things have kind of been happening on their own, and the traditional Armenian structures have basically been caught off guard.
What can we change, maybe, Patrick? Do you have any ideas what can be modified on both sides? What can the diaspora do better? What can Armenia do better in this approach?
For Armenia, it's a branding thing. There's tremendous advantages here from a business perspective, from a lifestyle perspective, which I'm sure we'll get to. And then from a diasporan perspective, it's my advice to everybody is always the same: is don't come here with rose-colored glasses. You have attachments to this place emotionally, but you don't have any real attachments. The dialect is different, and there's nothing wrong with that. Come here and figure out if this is where your heart lies. Because there are really great things about being here, but you have to discover it. And there's also huge annoyances, but it depends where your values are at. And I think that if most people, I have yet to meet any foreign diplomat who doesn't leave this place without tears. I've yet to meet foreigners who have come here and genuinely stayed more than 3 weeks, really experienced the country, not absolutely adore this place. It hasn't happened yet. So.
I think you'd say that there's a two-sided problem in which people who represent, so to speak, Armenia tend to look at the relationship with the diaspora as being purely transactional, in which there's certain expectations as to what the diaspora should provide to Armenia. And people in the diaspora have a expectation that Armenia should reflect their own romanticized vision of what a homeland should be, neither of which, of course, makes any sense in the 21st century.
What you're basically saying, from what I'm hearing from you, is that the diaspora has to be more Armenia-centric.
100%.
And Armenia has to be more obliging to the needs of the diaspora. So I think you've already answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. In general, are you optimistic for the future of Armenia? And what would you say to those who see nothing but doom and gloom?
I'd say, I think being morose is part of Armenian culture. We enjoy it. But the truth of the matter is that for every person who publicly complains about how there's no future, you have many, many, many Armenians who are very diligently and quietly working to build a future, which is I'm not optimistic because I'm hoping or as I see a future. I'm optimistic because I'm part of the process of building that future.
Yeah, I'm immensely optimistic. My terrible prediction, because I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form, is the coming years will be difficult, but once we break through that pain period, Armenia will be a leading country in this region. And I'm talking from a purely just economic perspective, from a cultural perspective, from human potential perspective. It's a great place to be. There's tremendous advantages for business, for wealth creation, for wealth accumulation. It's a great lifestyle. I'm extremely optimistic, and that's why I'm still here.
Like, our grandparents survived a genocide. There's nothing else they can do to us anymore that we can't just shrug off.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It was
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure talking to you. And once again, welcome.
Thanks for having us.